What does it mean to lose a war? To lose a war is not to have more troops killed than the enemy. To lose a war is not based on the undesirable outcomes, but to lose a war is to not have accomplished the main goal, being the essential reason for declaring war in the first place. Such is the case of both the war in Afghanistan and Vietnam. Communism is an economic and political system in which everything is owned by the working class and everyone works toward the same communal goal. This system limits individuals' freedoms and pursuits of wealth, which is in direct conflict with the American way of life. The U.S. strongly believed that if one country came under the influence of communism, other surrounding countries would follow in a domino effect. And this was the main reason for entering Vietnam. Prior to the U.S. stepping in, France had control of the nation, then called French Indochina, and the Vietnamese desperately wanted to be liberated from their oppression. The revolutionary leader, Ho Chi Minh, rose to power in Vietnam, and he greatly sought to cooperate with countries to help Vietnam be freed from France. In 1945, Ho Chi Minh asked for U.S. assistance in removing France from the country. We ask what has been graciously granted to the Philippines. Like the Philippines, our goal is full independence and full cooperation with the United States. We will do our best to make this independence and cooperation profitable to the whole world. Despite Minh reaching out to multiple American officials, his plea was continually ignored. With all else having failed, Ho Chi Minh turned to the communists for help. Consequently, America became less and less inclined to support Ho Chi Minh due to his communist affiliation and the belief that he had become a puppet of the Soviets. In an attempt to nation build, the U.S. held the first democratic election in South Vietnam in 1954. The candidates were Ngo Dinh Diem versus Bao Dai. The U.S. backed Diem, who American leaders felt would be agreeable to American authority in Vietnam. Voters complained that they were forced to vote for Diem, and those that did not were beaten by CIA-supported Vietnam forces. The result of the election was 98.2% for Diem. Diem's American advisors told him to change the vote count and release a number no larger than 70%, or else the vote would not be believable. As one of his first acts of non-cooperation, he refused and claimed the 98.2% victory. The world immediately knew that the election had been rigged and his authority was undermined. The U.S. officially entered the Vietnam War in 1965 to fight against the will of the majority of the Vietnamese and to support their own interests.
The time has come for America to hear the truth about this tragic war. There comes a time when silence is betrayal. We were taking the black young men who had been crippled by society and sending them 8,000 miles away to guarantee liberties in Southeast Asia, which they had not found in Southwest Georgia and East Harlem. And I knew that I could never again raise my voice against the violence of the oppressed in the ghettos without having first spoken clearly to the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, my own government.
One of the most horrific incidents of violence against civilians during the Vietnam War was the My Lai massacre. A company of American soldiers brutally killed the majority of the population of the Sun Mai village in South Vietnam on March 1968. It is believed that as many as 500 people, including women, children, and the elderly, were killed in the My Lai massacre. U.S. Army officials were able to cover it up from the American public for a year until the revelation of an American soldier led to a thorough investigation. When the cover-up of the My Lai massacre was revealed to the public, this only caused more American people to lose trust in their own government. 2 months after signing the Vietnam Peace Treaty, The last U.S. combat troops leave South Vietnam as Hanoi frees the remaining American prisoners of war held in North Vietnam. U.S. involvement in Vietnam was a complete failure, and the whole purpose of the war was not achieved. The main goal was to rid the country of communism, and by doing so, to prevent other surrounding nations from falling into communism. The involvement of the U.S. in Vietnam was not only unjustifiable, but also in vain because it yielded no good outcomes.
It appeared to bank sharply and smash directly, perhaps purposefully, into, oh my goodness,
Oh, God.
there's another one. Oh my goodness, there's another one.
This seems to be on purpose.
Oh my goodness, now it's obvious, I think, that there's a second plane just crashed into the World Trade Center. I think we have a terrorist act of proportions that we cannot begin to imagine at this juncture.
Our war on terror begins with Al-Qaeda, but it does not end there. It will not end until every terrorist group of global reach has been found, stopped, and defeated.
September 11th, 2001, the largest terror attack on American soil. 3,000 people killed. Then, just 1 month later, the start of America's longest war. The objective? Kill or capture those who have done the most harm and to eradicate terrorist organizations. Afghanistan has been a country under siege by terrorist organizations since the early 1980s. The main objective of many of these groups is to spread their religion and rid the Middle East of Western influence. The U.S. was able to defeat Al-Qaeda, who at the time was the most dangerous group in the area. Once they were taken care of, the focus shifted to the Taliban. As the fight against the Taliban continued, America also wanted to establish a working democratic government in Afghanistan. The fight against the Taliban brought the U.S. into Iraq, which allowed the Afghanistan government that was being rebuilt to crumble, and the hard work put in by the U.S. went to waste. Towards the ending stages of the war, the U.S. boosted the presence of soldiers in Afghanistan, with the goal of protecting the civilians and attempting peace talks with the Taliban. Slowly, the U.S. faded out of the country, and leaving roughly 10,000 soldiers in the country to protect bases and to train Afghan security forces. This war has become one of America's most costly wars, estimating over $650 billion put into use. Thousands of Americans have been injured and killed. The new terror group ISIS has taken control over several countries in the Middle East. The Taliban is on a resurgence in Afghanistan. Of those billions of dollars spent to rebuild Afghanistan, much of it has been destroyed, misused, or fallen into the wrong hands. The Taliban currently have more territory than they did at the start of the war. Terrorist attacks have killed 5 times the amount of people than they did 15 years ago. Despite the U.S. relentless efforts to remove terrorism from the world, it is more dangerous now than it has ever been before.
When we think about losing a war, we think about how badly the war was lost, the number of lives lost, both civilian and militants. We think about the destruction of the land where the war was fought, but many people fail to think about what losing a war truly means. All wars are fought because there are reasons behind them, whether it be political or religious. There is always a reason for a war to be fought. In the cases of the Vietnam and Afghanistan wars, the reasons for fighting were political. The Vietnam War was fought to stop the spread of communism and the hope that the domino effect would take place and start to destroy communism completely. The war in Afghanistan was fought in retaliation of the September 11th attacks in the United States. The United States entered Afghanistan with the aim to stop the spread of terrorism and to cut the heads off of the leading terrorist organizations. Vietnam was a display of American fallibility, lack of judgment, lack of understanding of root ideas, lack of support for people to determine their own destiny and govern themselves, as well as a display of just how brutal America was willing to be to attempt to get its way. After the U.S. left, North Vietnam took complete control and re-education camps were established in southern Vietnam. To these camps was just a front that would keep outside interest away from what was really happening. These camps instead were more like harsh labor camps. The people placed in these camps were of military descent that fought for the South. as well as their families. An estimated 1 to 2.5 million people were forced into these camps. Of that estimation, 165,000 of them died in those camps. As with every war, a side can have its successes. In the Vietnam War, there are little successes that can be claimed by the U.S. They were able to put a leader in charge of South Vietnam after influencing the elections. Can it be said that the forced imprisonment of millions of people and the deaths of 1 million plus people is a sign of winning a war? It seems that's quite the contrary. The side that the U.S. was fighting against took control of the country. Too many people died from all sides, and communism did not stop its spread. So did the U.S. really win the war? As for Afghanistan, the U.S. had many military successes, including the deaths of Osama bin Laden, Mullah Omar, and Saddam Hussein. The deaths of these leaders damaged terrorist organizations heavily for a short period of time. The Afghanistan War became the longest in U.S. history, lasting for 13 years. The aim of the war in Afghanistan was to get rid of the Taliban rule in the country and establish a democratic system of government. This task was successful, and slowly the U.S. pulled out of the country. However, the U.S. thought that the domino effect could happen again, where with the fall of one terrorist organization would bring others to their knees and most or all terrorism could be removed from the world. As it turned out, the U.S. was completely wrong. Although the Taliban and other groups were heavily damaged and reduced in numbers, more groups with larger amounts of people came up from the ashes of those fallen groups. The poorly trained Afghan forces that were meant to maintain the peace after the U.S. left abandoned their posts that contained billions of dollars worth of equipment, which fell into the hands of radical terrorists. Then the radical group of ISIS rose to become the most powerful organization in the Middle East. Throughout the war, the number of attacks and deaths related to terrorism rose significantly. Terrorists have become more and more active, and this has been seen with the many attacks within the Middle East and in Eastern Europe. In 2015, Paris was attacked twice, which resulted in the deaths of almost 150 people and hundreds more injured. In our own city of Boston, the marathon bombings were in retaliation of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. Terrorism can be compared to a hydra. When you cut off one head, two more grow back. In this case, the U.S. picked the wrong place to fight this war. The area is too filled with people that are willing to die in order to destroy Western nations. No matter what happens, more and more people will join the fight against the West. The Afghanistan war took the lives of tens of thousands of people. This war was inevitable after the September 11th attacks. But as with Vietnam, the U.S. rushed into the situation with little intelligence. This caused the war to drag on for years, and the U.S. pulled out without having completed its goal, and as active today as it was 15 years ago, and if not more active. So were these wars won or lost? Today Vietnam is still under communist control. Afghanistan is the second most terrorized country in the world. People from Vietnam are still grieving those loss. The Taliban is on the resurgence in Afghanistan, with ISIS beginning to enter the country. Some wars just cannot be won. Vietnam and Afghanistan just happen to be two of them.